Okinawa, May 1945. Heat shimmered above the camp fences, a trembling haze over rusted barbed wire. American soldiers shouted over the whine of generators, the smell of diesel thick in the air. In the middle of the compound, a young Japanese nurse in a streaked uniform stood motionless, her face pale beneath the sun. A glob of spit slid down her sleeve, then came the order, sharp, casual, like a match struck in silence, "Lick it off." The other soldiers froze. Some laughed nervously, unsure whether this was a joke or an act of dominance. The nurse's lips trembled. Around her, hundreds of captured Japanese. Men, medics, clerks watched from the ground, heads bowed, eyes darting between fear and disbelief. The war had taught them to expect death, not humiliation. Over 7,000 Japanese troops had surrendered on Okinawa, around 330 of them women. Many were nurses, trained not for battle but for mercy. Now they were prisoners of the same men who once bombed their hospitals. The dirt under their bare knees burned like coal, but they didn't flinch. Their captors wanted a reaction. They stayed silent. A corporal, barely 20, stepped closer. His boots left dark prints in the dust. "You heard me," he hissed, voice shaking more from adrenaline than anger. One of his comrades muttered, "That's enough, man," but no one moved. The nurse stared at the spit, milky streak glistening on khaki fabric, and bent down slowly. A fly buzzed. The camp fell silent except for the distant clank of mess tins. Then, before her lips touched the cloth, a barked voice cut through the heat. "Stand down." Sergeant Miller emerged from the shade of the command post, jaw clenched, eyes locked on his men. The nurse froze mid-motion. The corporal straightened like a child caught stealing. Miller's boots stopped inches from them. "We don't do that," he said quietly, each word landing heavier than a shout. In that instant, shame moved through the air, thicker than the dust, sharper than the sunlight. The nurse looked up, meeting Miller's gaze. For a heartbeat, enemy and captor stared at each other, both uncertain who had just been humiliated more. But Miller's next words weren't for her. They were for his men, and they would set the tone for everything that followed. The order hung in the humid air like a curse. "Lick it off." The words didn't fade. They seemed to echo inside every soldier's skull. Some froze, eyes darting toward Sergeant Miller, waiting for him to say something. Others looked away, halves, murking, pretending not to feel the discomfort crawling under their skin. The sun bore down at over 95 degrees, making the metal canteens too hot to touch. Dust stuck to sweat, and the smell of burnt canvas mixed with human fear. The young nurse didn't move at first. Her jaw tightened, eyes unfocused, half defiance, half survival. Behind her, a group of captured Japanese medics watched silently. They'd been stripped of insignias, but not of pride. The Americans' 20 guards for nearly 300 prisoners had grown used to control, yet in this single moment it felt fragile. A corporal shifted uneasily. You heard him. He whispered to her, his tone cracking. She bent down, slow as a falling leaf, the world shrinking to that patch of fabric. When her tongue brushed the coarse uniform cloth, every sound seemed to stop the shouting, the flies, even the wind. The taste hit her instantly, salt, metal, and something foully human. Shame filled her throat before the taste did. Later, she'd write in her diary, it wasn't pain, it was silence that burned. A few soldiers turned away, boots grinding gravel. One mumbled, "Jesus, man." Another laughed nervously to mask his guilt. Sergeant Miller stood rigid, hands clenched, his own face caught between duty and disgust. For him, the war had been brutal, but it had rules that this moment was tearing apart. In that blinding Okinawan sunlight, Humanity flickered like a dying flame. The corporal who gave the order swallowed hard, suddenly aware that every prisoner and guard was watching him. The laughter died. The silence that followed was louder than any explosion Miller had ever heard. The nurse rose slowly, a single tear cutting a line through the dust on her cheek. She did not look away. The corporal stepped back, eyes down. Then Miller's boots scraped the ground as he stepped forward. His voice came out low, shaking not from fear, but from control slipping. "That's enough," he said. The next moment the sergeant would have to decide whether to stay silent or defy his own men. Sergeant Miller's shadow fell across the dust, long and sharp. "That's enough," he said again, voice low but final. The camp froze. The corporal who gave the order stood stiff, lips parting as if to argue, then shutting under the weight of Miller's stare. The sergeant's jaw flexed once, like a man fighting his own temper. For a long second, no one moved. Only the flies buzzed, circling the rim of a dented water drum nearby. Miller turned toward the nurse. "Get up," he said quietly. She hesitated, then rose, eyes fixed on the ground. He nodded once, curt but not cruel. "Go back." She stepped away slowly, her sandals scraping dirt, vanishing into the cluster of other women in torn field uniforms. Miller watched her until she disappeared into the shadows of the tent line. Then he turned back to his men. "You think this is a joke?" His voice cut like a whip now. The corporal opened his mouth, nothing came out. Miller's voice rose. "We ain't animals, you understand." The guards shifted awkwardly, some staring at their boots, others pretending to check their rifles. Miller's heartbeat pounded in his temples. He'd seen what war did. Bodies torn apart, minds burned out. But this was different. It was the slow rot of decency. After D-Day, reports had flooded in, brawls, drunken assaults, unauthorized punishments. Command said discipline breaches had risen by nearly 18% in the Pacific. It was the exhaustion, the endless blood, the sense that rules no longer mattered. But Miller cared maybe too much. He yanked the corporal's sleeve. "You'll write an incident note," he snapped. "And I'll send it up." The younger man's face went white. "Sir, it was just what?" Miller's eyes burned. "Just shame." The camp stayed silent long after he walked away. Dust swirled behind him, the echo of his boots fading toward the command tent. For a brief moment, the prisoners whispered in Japanese, one voice trembling. Even among enemies, there were rules. That night, under a lantern's weak light, Miller sat at his desk and started writing the report. His pen hesitated at the first line. Incident May 10th, Okinawa. He stopped. He knew sending it might cost him more than silence ever would. But silence was the real disease. By dawn, he had made up his mind to deliver it himself. By dawn, Sergeant Miller's report was folded neatly inside his breast pocket. Ink still smudged from the night's humidity. The camp woke to barking orders and the clatter of tin cups. But Miller walked straight to the command tent. The flap lifted, and he stepped into the dim space where a single bulb swung over a map of Okinawa. His commanding officer, Captain Reynolds, looked up from a stack of casualty reports. "You're early," he muttered. Miller saluted, then placed the folded paper on the desk. "Incident report, sir." Reynolds sighed, eyes narrowing. "He didn't touch it. Let me guess, another brawl." "No, sir." Miller said quietly, "A disciplinary violation against a POW. That got Reynolds's attention." The captain leaned back, chair creaking. Outside, the distant rumble of trucks carried through the canvas walls. "What kind of violation?" Miller's jaw tightened. "One of ours spat on a prisoner, gave her an order no man should ever give." For a moment, the tent was silent. Then Reynolds leaned forward, voice low. Write it down, but don't send it." Miller blinked. "Sir." Reynolds exhaled slowly. "We're days from ending this damn war. You start putting this on paper, you'll have half the press corps crawling through the wire. You want that on your conscience." Outside, boots thudded past. Inside, Miller's hands balled into fists. "Sir, we can't, we can, and we will." Reynolds snapped, suddenly sharp. "There's an image to protect." The captain slid the report back across the table. "Keep your men in line, quietly." His tone softened, almost weary. "You've done good work. Don't ruin it over one moment of bad judgment." Miller stood still for a full 10 seconds. Then he took the paper, saluted, and walked out. The air outside felt heavier than before. Reports later showed that nearly 42% of misconduct complaints during the final Pacific months were buried or erased. The logic was simple. Ending the war mattered more than exposing the rot. That evening, Miller burned the report in a tin barrel behind the tents. The smoke rose thin and gray, blending into the sea haze, and yet, from that day, something subtle shifted in the camp. The guards avoided eye contact, and the women noticed. After that morning, something in the camp changed, but no one said why. Orders still barked, rifles still gleamed in the sun, but the cruelty lost its edge. The same guards who once laughed now kept their distance, eyes lowered. When the bell rang for chow, the women noticed the bowls were heavier. The watery soup had rice in it now. Someone had doubled the rations. The rumor spread quietly, like smoke slipping through canvas seams. The sergeant burned a paper. One nurse whispered, "Maybe they're scared." Another shook her head. "No, maybe they remembered we're human." In the kitchen tent, Private Hayes ladled stew into tin bowls. His face was red from the stove heat, but his hands moved slower than usual, deliberate. That morning, he'd slipped 2 extra scoops into the women's pot. No one ordered it. No one would ever ask. "Don't tell the C.O." He muttered to the cook beside him, "Ain't breaking rules if nobody knows." It was a small rebellion, the kind born from guilt, not mercy, but the prisoners felt it. For the first time, they didn't eat under shouted commands. They ate under silence, and silence, for once, was kindness. The numbers shifted quietly, too. Rations for POW had climbed from roughly 1,200 to 2,000 calories per day, a statistic that looked clean on paper but carried the weight of shame behind it. In the evenings, as the sun dropped behind the ridgeline, the guards would leave buckets of tea near the gate. No explanation, no words. The women lined up, one by one, dipping cracked cups into the warm liquid. The nurse who once licked the spit sat with her cup in both hands. The steam curled like ghosts of things unspoken. "Why do they feed us now?" she whispered. No one answered. Out beyond the wire, a truck rumbled by carrying crates marked medical supplies. Inside, a few soldiers swapped gossip. "Heard about that spit thing?" One said. "Word got around, even up to the brass." The other shrugged. "They'll bury it, they always do. But rumors, once loose, don't die. They travel with the wind, cross fences, change shape." And by the time the story reached the next camp, it had become something else entirely. The story didn't stay behind the wire. Within a week, whispers of the spit order crawled across Okinawa like wind through dry grass. One camp guard mentioned it over poker. Another repeated it in a letter home. By the time those letters reached a U.S. censorship unit in Guam, the rumor had mutated. Some said the prisoners were men. Others claimed it happened under Japanese captivity. But the phrase stuck. They made her lick it off. Across the fence line, Japanese POW traded the story in low voices. "Americans humiliate women," one said. "No, one American. Another corrected, almost hopefully, yet the sting remained. The tale crossed camps faster than mail, bending truth and fear together until it became legend. At the intelligence post, a Navy linguist slid a confiscated letter across the desk. "They're using it as propaganda now," he said. "Japanese radios calling us barbarians." The officer reading it sighed. "Barbarians win wars," he muttered before stamping the paper restricted. Every week, U.S. Intel intercepted more than 600 letters from Pacific POW zones. Most were harmless requests for cigarettes, mentions of weather, but a few, like these, smelled of scandal. One report warned, enemy morale improving via rumors of Allied misconduct. Inside the Okinawa camp, the women noticed new faces, officers with clipboards, cameras slung over shoulders. They spoke little, just observed. The nurse who'd endured the order recognized what it meant. Their shame was now a subject of study. She watched as an American with a camera knelt, clicking photos of laundry lines, latrines, normal, a life. But the lens never turned toward her. Our shame became their propaganda. She murmured to another nurse, "We are ghosts they can control." By late July, command realized the damage. If the rumor reached Tokyo, it could fuel resistance. Orders were drafted, stamped, distributed under tight secrecy. All personnel to maintain dignity of enemy prisoners. No exceptions. For the guards, it was just another memo. But for men like Miller, it meant something deeper. A chance to draw a line between rage and humanity before the war ended completely. He read the directive under lantern light, thumb tracing the inked date, August 2nd, 1945. And for the first time in weeks, he exhaled, August 2nd, 1945. The order came down from headquarters, printed in dense black ink. All personnel will maintain the dignity and humane treatment of prisoners under their supervision. It was called the Conduct Directive, and copies arrived folded, smudged, already creased by too many hands. In the Okinawa camp, Sergeant Miller read it twice before pinning it to the message board. Then he just stood there, staring. Around him, the camp felt different, tense, but quieter. The directive wasn't just words. It was an admission that something had gone wrong. And every soldier knew it. Miller ran a finger over the typed date. The paper smelled faintly of engine oil and damp canvas. "About time," he muttered. For the first time since the incident, he felt a strange weight lift followed by another settling in its place. Responsibility. The memo spread across the Pacific. Compliance, later reports said, reached barely 63%. But even partial decency was better than the moral vacuum before it. That evening, the guards lined up for briefing. Miller's tone was firm, measured. "No more stunts, no more games. You treat them like soldiers, because that's what they were before they surrendered." A few men nodded, some rolled their eyes, but no one dared argue. The rumor of his last report still floated in the air. On the other side of the wire, the nurse sat against a crate, a stub of pencil in her fingers. She'd scavenged a few sheets from a medical logbook. The diary began quietly, "We are ghosts of honor. Even our silence has weight." She wrote under the flicker of a lantern while the guards' voices carried faintly across the camp. The new rules hadn't brought comfort, just confusion. One guard even greeted her with a nod that morning, clumsy, awkward, maybe guilty. She couldn't tell any more what mercy meant. When Miller walked the perimeter that night, he saw her writing. Their eyes met for only a moment before he turned away, pretending not to notice. He didn't know she was recording everything. The heat, the shame, the sound of the order he could never forget. By dawn, the diary's first page was complete, and what she wrote next would outlast the war itself. The lantern hissed as she leaned over her paper, the stub of pencil trembling between her fingers. "We were ghosts of honor," she wrote. The words came slowly, like wounds reopening. Each line carved her memory into permanence. The heat, the spit, the silence that followed. Outside, frogs croaked in the flooded ditches, and a diesel generator coughed in the dark. Her name was Midori Nakamura, once a nurse from Nagasaki. She'd treated soldiers with shredded limbs, sewn flesh with shaking hands, whispered prayers to men who never woke. Now, in captivity, she recorded what mercy looked like when it was twisted by power. There were 87 Japanese nurses captured on Okinawa. Most kept their thoughts locked behind lowered eyes. Midori refused. "If we vanish," she wrote, "let the pages speak." Each night she hid the diary under a mess tin beside her cot. The paper smelled of sweat and mildew. She wrote about the moment of the spit, the sting of salt, the sound of boots grinding gravel, the sergeant's shadow cutting through sunlight. "He stopped them," she scribbled, "but the spit never left my tongue." Sometimes she imagined what his face looked like before the war. Did he have a family? Did his mother still wait for letters that never mentioned women kneeling in dirt? On one page she drew the camp's outline, rows of tents, the latrine trench, the medical hut where she cleaned wounds with boiled rainwater. She described how one guard secretly left soap near the barrel. Maybe it was kindness, she wrote. Maybe it was guilt. Miller's patrol boots passed her tent often at night. He never entered, but she could always tell it was him by the rhythm. 3 slow steps, then a pause. She didn't know why, but that rhythm calmed her. By the end of August, the war's sound had changed. Distant guns quieted, replaced by radio crackles and the smell of rain. She wrote, "They say it will end soon, but how does shame end?" Before she slept, she folded her last page, pressing it flat beneath the tin. Tomorrow, she knew, the camp would be visited. Inspections always meant danger, especially for the truth hidden in her diary. The trucks arrived without warning, gray shapes grinding through morning mist. Men in khaki and armbands stepped out, carrying clipboards and cameras. The guards snapped to attention as a Red Cross officer adjusted his cap and said flatly, "Inspection." His accent was clipped European, his expression unreadable. Inside the camp, whispers rippled like wind through grass. "The outsiders are here." Midori clutched her diary under her uniform. Her fingers trembled as she tucked it into the folds of her bedding. She had seen inspections before, but never this formal. Today felt different. The prisoners were lined up in rows, backs straight, hands visible. The sun had barely risen, yet sweat already slicked their foreheads. The Red Cross men walked the line, murmuring to interpreters, occasionally jotting notes. Behind them trailed an American lieutenant, his jaw tight. He wanted this to look perfect. "Food supply?" the officer asked. Miller pointed to stacked crates. "Rations doubled 2 weeks ago. Hygiene, daily wash rotations. Everything looked in order on the surface." Midori's eyes darted toward the officers as they approached. One of them stopped near her, gaze softening. "You are nurse?" he asked in halting English. She nodded. He smiled faintly, scribbled something, then moved on. She exhaled, shoulders shaking. The inspection camera clicked. Frames of women standing obediently in sunlight, soldiers smiling stiffly, tents arranged in symmetry. On film, it all looked humane, clean, controlled. But what the camera captured wasn't the truth. It was performance. The Red Cross completed over 2,300 inspections across the Pacific that year. None recorded the stories that mattered most. The cameras saw everything except our shame. Midori whispered to the woman beside her. When the officers reached the medical tent, Miller followed them in. The interpreter asked questions about supplies, about disease. Miller answered mechanically. his mind elsewhere, on the tin box hidden under a nurse's cot, just a few yards away. Outside, the prisoners were dismissed. The camp exhaled, tension breaking like glass, but in the nurse's corner, fear stayed. Midori sat back down, palms slick with sweat. The inspection had passed, but barely. Tomorrow they'd search again, she knew. And if they found her diary, the story of the spit would die before it was ever told. Night fell heavy after the inspection, no wind, no voices, just the slow hum of mosquitoes circling the lanterns. Midori couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the officer's pen hovering near her cot, inches from discovery. The diary lay under her blanket, its spine damp with sweat. She knew she had to make a choice: keep it whole and risk everything, or destroy the one page that could damn her forever. Outside, a truck coughed to life, its headlights sweeping briefly across the tent's thin canvas. The flicker lit her hands as she tore the page free. The sound was small but final, a soft rip that felt louder than a scream. On that paper were 20 lines describing the spit command, every word raw and trembling. She stared at it one last time. The pencil marks shimmered faintly in the lantern glow. Then she whispered, "Better ashes than evidence." She carried the page to the kitchen fire pit. The embers glowed orange against the night. Kneeling, she fed the paper into the coals. It curled, blackened, vanished. Smoke rose briefly, sharp and sweet with ink. By the end of the war, roughly 15% of POW diaries would be destroyed this same way, burned to protect their writers or to silence them. Truth was as fragile as the paper that held it. When Midori returned to her tent, the air smelled of smoke and rain. She slipped what remained of the diary back into its hiding place. A nurse beside her asked softly, "What did you do?" "Nothing," Midori said, voice flat. Nothing left to do. The next morning brought a strange stillness. A guard walked by, humming a tune from home. The sky had turned a faint silver gray, the kind of color that came before big changes, and then, just before noon, the horizon trembled. A low drone filled the air, rhythmic and distant. Everyone in the camp, guards and prisoners alike, looked up. Miller stepped out of his tent, squinting. "That's not a storm," he muttered. The sound grew louder, steady as a heartbeat. Midori lifted her face toward the sky. Above the wire, silhouettes appeared, dozens of planes, flying low and straight. Liberation was coming, though no one yet knew what it would take away with it. The engines came first, a rolling thunder that made the tents tremble. Then came the dust, thick enough to taste. Liberation wasn't the roar of victory movies promised. It was chaos, shouted orders, and the rattle of trucks grinding through the camp gates. American units from the mainland had arrived to process survivors. But to the prisoners, the men looked no different from the guards already there. Midori stood among the others, squinting against the sunlight. Trucks rolled past, their sides marked with white stars. The soldiers on them waved, but no one waved back. The camp gates creaked open wider, metal screaming as if in protest. Sergeant Miller walked beside the convoy, helmet low, uniform sweat stained. He was supposed to feel relief. Instead, he felt hollow. The new officers barked quick instructions: catalog prisoners, separate medical personnel, prepare lists for transport. Everything moved fast, mechanical, impersonal. When the order came to escort the women toward the trucks, Miller froze. He saw Midori for the first time in weeks. Her face was thinner, eyes darker, but the same faint calm lived there. She met his gaze once. No anger, no thanks, just quiet recognition. Then she looked away. Freedom should have felt like oxygen, but it didn't. It felt sterile, rehearsed. For the women, liberation meant another march under foreign orders, another set of eyes measuring their worth. For the men, it meant pretending none of it had happened. Okinawa's formal surrender had been signed on June 22, 1945. The war's dust hadn't even settled, yet the moral wreckage already filled the air. A few soldiers cheered when the new flag was raised over the camp. Others stared at the ground. Miller watched as the prisoners climbed into trucks. He couldn't speak. A young lieutenant beside him whispered, "They'll be shipped out soon. Good riddance, huh?" Miller didn't answer. He just kept watching as the trucks rumbled away, trailing clouds of pale dust that coated his boots. Midori turned once, just before the gate closed behind her. The camp shrank in the distance. Its fences, its shadows, its ghosts. Freedom doesn't feel clean, she murmured to herself, and as the engines faded, the sea wind carried one sound back toward the hills, the faint metallic clang of chains being packed away for good. The sea smelled of rust and diesel as the transport ship groaned away from Okinawa's coast. The horizon burned orange behind it, fading into ash, blue dusk. On the deck, rows of Japanese prisoners, men and women alike, sat wrapped in thin gray blankets, staring at nothing. Freedom was supposed to feel light, but everything about that ship felt heavy. The air, the silence, the weight of what they'd survived. Midori leaned against the railing, her eyes tracing the foam that churned in the ship's wake. Waves slapped the hull with slow, deliberate rhythm, like an old heartbeat that refused to die. She held a small notebook against her chest, its cover made from scavenged cardboard. The original diary was gone, burned. But the story was still alive in her mind. A nurse beside her whispered, "We're going home." Midori nodded, though she wasn't sure what home meant anymore. The cities had been bombed, families scattered, honor rewritten. Somewhere behind them lay the camp, still echoing with memories no one wanted to claim. Below deck, the sound of coughing mixed with the steady thump of engines. The Red Cross crew handed out rice balls, counted heads, marked names on clipboards. They said repatriation of Japanese POW would take years, nearly 1.5 million by 1947. But in that moment, numbers meant nothing. Every person on that ship was a fragment of something broken. At night, she opened her new notebook. The pencil moved slowly at first, carving her voice into the paper. Some stains never wash away. She wrote. Then a pause, the sea hissed below. She added, "But maybe the water remembers. Miller was not on that ship." But somewhere on another vessel heading home to California, he stared at the same horizon. Maybe he thought of the woman he'd defended. Maybe he didn't. War had a way of erasing names, keeping only ghosts. As dawn cracked over the Pacific, Midori looked east. Japan's faint outline appeared mountain ridges like charcoal strokes against pale sky. She pressed the notebook to her lips, whispering a prayer without words. The engines slowed, the coast grew closer, and before the land even touched her feet, she knew what she had to do with her final page. The coastline of Kagoshima stretched before her. Gray sand, dark pines, and the distant curve of a ruined city rising from the mist. The ship's horn wailed once, low and tired, as if it too carried the burden of everything unseen. When the ramp lowered, Midori stepped onto the pier barefoot. The wooden planks were wet with morning dew, but she barely felt them. She had made it home, though home was now a place that no longer recognized her. Japanese officials guided the returning POW toward medical tents. Flashbulbs popped. Reporters scribbled in notebooks, recording sanitized versions of their suffering. Nurses rescued. The headlines would read, but rescue was not what this felt like. It felt like walking into a world where her own reflection had changed. She carried the small notebook inside her sleeve. The last line she had written on the ship was still smudged by salt air. The war ended. The taste did not. Outside the tent, she wandered toward the beach. Waves rolled in slow, deliberate, as if measuring time differently now. She knelt in the sand and began to dig with her hands, the cold earth clinging to her nails. The notebook cardboard cover, thin pages looked fragile in the dawn light. She pressed it into the shallow pit, covering it gently, palm by palm, until only a small mound remained. Around her, other survivors talked quietly, waiting for trains, for families, for orders. No one noticed her small act of burial. She stood, brushed her hands clean, and watched the sea flatten itself against the horizon. Of the thousands of Japanese POW repatriated, only 3 known female diaries from the Pacific War would survive. Midori's was not among them, but maybe, she thought, that was right. Some truths weren't meant to be found by historians. Some belonged to the tide. She whispered one final line, not to the sea but to herself. Maybe history will forget what we couldn't. Behind her, the sound of engines started again, trucks carrying survivors to new assignments, new silences. Ahead of her, the ocean stretched endlessly, pale and merciless. Midori turned once more toward the water, her shadow long and thin across the sand, before stepping back into a world that still didn't know what honor truly cost.